and thank you for coming tonight, because our competition is drinking with Cardinal Whirl. So appreciate the effort and the sacrifice that took. Besides holy cards, Britain has given us a great resource in this book that Austen has written, How to Defend the Faith Without Raising Your Voice, just published from our Sunday Visitor. And so I only got to meet Austen for the first time on Friday night, but I've long time been a fan, in part because of this group he started in London, and it's called Catholic Voices. And the idea is to make the case for the church, put the case for the church in the public square, with well-catechized, camera-ready, ego-free, and
media-friendly, studio-ready, and ego-free.
There we go. It's been a success there, and we're now just starting it in the United States. Myself and a few friends have brought Austen and his co-founder Jack Valero over this past weekend, and there's a training class of 16. And anyhow, I'm with no more delay. Austen has a background in journalism and also working for the church as well. I'll let you start off talking a little bit about the book and Catholic Voices, and then we can go into some questions.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's a real honour to be here at this place, which I heard so much about, the Catholic Information Centre, and that I should, my first visit here, be to celebrate and launch this book and to give you a talk is a real honour. I feel like I've made it. And indeed, the fact that Catholic Voices is now in the US, and we've just had 3 days in Virginia. Where were we? Warrenton, Virginia. It was a hunting lodge with guns on the wall. Exactly what I expect happens when you hang out with conservatives in the US.
I'm from New York, so I'm not really into guns, so I tried to take the guns down and put crucifixes up, but it didn't work in every room.
Anyway, so the story of Catholic Voices ends in this hunting lodge in Virginia, but it begins, or at least the most recent chapter, but it begins in 2010 in London when, actually in 2009, a year before the Pope's visit, so this was September 2009, when there was a disastrous debate in London organised by a public debating society, and the motion was the Catholic Church is a force for good in the world. Now, an uncontroversial motion. People voted just before the speeches, and they were actually on the whole against, so it was a reasonably hostile audience. But by the time the Catholics had finished speaking and the others, including Christopher Hitchens and Stephen Fry, had finished attacking the church, it was about 96% against. So in other words, the more the Catholics spoke, the more people turned against them. And this led to a kind of cri de coeur. What has happened to Catholic apologetics? Why is it that we're so bad at putting the case in the public square? And I'd had some experience doing this stuff on TV and radio, first as deputy editor of The Tablet, which is an intellectual Catholic weekly in the UK, and then later I worked for the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster. And so in those capacities, I've often been on radio and TV. And my colleague Jack Valero, who also is the co-founder of Catholic Voices, who also has appeared regularly, and I was sitting over lunch contemplating this result with about the time the papal visit was announced, and we thought, gosh, this is going to be a disaster, because as the Pope arrives in Britain, the spotlight will be on the church. There's quite a well-organised group of humanists and atheists and secularists in Britain who we knew were planning protests and so on. And we just thought, this is really going to be very bad. And so we thought back to a project that we had done together. And here's the Opus Dei connection, back in 2006, when Jack, who's, by the way, a member of Opus Dei, I'm not, and I set up this thing called the the Da Vinci Code Response Group, which was a media team designed to answer queries in the media about the claims made in the book, which had become then a film. And it was a great success. We only had it for a couple of weeks, but we made ourselves available to the studios. We said, look, we're happy to talk about anything. You can ask us whether Opus Dei really does carry out assassinations in order to cover up the greatest secret that the world's ever known, whether Jesus in fact married a woman, how many gospels there were. We're happy to talk about any of that, and we're available, and you can drop us, and And looking back on that experience, which really did work very well, we thought, let's do something similar. So we talked to a few people about the idea, and we came up with a more ambitious idea, which is to get a group of ordinary Catholics, by which I mean the kind of Catholics with jobs and mortgages, and in other words, not professional Catholics, not people who worked for the church or in Catholic organizations, but the kind of people actually who you never see on TV and radio. and invite them to train them to speak compellingly, humanly, and well about the what we call neuralgic issues, which are the issues where church and society clash. So we did this we did a training for 6 months. We had 25 young people who, by the way, we recruited and interviewed. I mean, they were selected from quite a long list of applicants. And we brought in experts, and we took these neuralgic issues, and every couple of weeks we met and we drilled down the issues. Why is it that society and church clash over these things in particular? And we went in and we developed a method. And we then obviously did media skills training, and we went out when the Pope was in the UK, actually mostly in the weeks leading up to it, when Protest the Pope would almost every day issue a press release accusing the church of something. The media would pick it up, grateful actually for the opportunity to curtain raise the papal visit, and then we would be there with them. So actually we had a lot of fun and a lot of practice, and we did a lot of programs. We did over 100 TV and radio programs, both in the lead up to and during the papal visit. And everybody said, at least a lot of people said, how wonderful it is to have ordinary Catholics, articulate, young people who can just put the case of the church so well. This really has changed the way people see the church. And so we were encouraged to continue. We said, well, really, we just set this up for the papal visit and we have no money and we don't know what we're... But people said, just carry on. And I felt, well, if it's of God, applying the Gamaliel principle, that if it's of God, nothing's going to stop it. If it isn't, it'll pretty quickly die. We set about planning the kind of post-Catholic Voices, post-papal visit stage. And since then, since September 2010, it has actually taken off in really a very remarkable and surprising to me way. We've produced books, and this is the American edition of the UK one we brought out last year. The UK one was called Catholic Voices, Putting the Church's Case in an Era of 24-Hour News, and I much prefer this title, which is How to Defend the Faith Without Raising Your Voice, which was OSV's suggestion. This, by the way, is a completely Americanized text. You won't find any Britishness in there. It's all been ruthlessly Americanized, and as soon as you open it, you'll smell pecan pie. But John Norton, who's the editor of Austen Ivereigh, which I write for, helped me do that and did it really, really well. And the book is much improved, actually, I think, from the UK version. So that was one of the fruits of the project, because people said to us, actually, what you've been doing, which is going into these issues and learning about how to put them, we could all benefit from. And in fact, we started to realize during those briefing sessions and applying the methodology, which I'll explain in a minute, our Catholic Voices, our young people, were coming to us saying, I've had the most amazing conversations in the office, in the workplace, among my family. Wow, this thing really, this works, and it should have a wider application, hence the book. And then other things that have happened since then have been, we set up an academy to sustain the projects. We have monthly meetings now, which attract about 120, performing slightly, I guess, the role, actually, that this place performs in Catholic public life here in DC. And then we've done other speakers training programs. We did another one last year in Leeds. We're doing another one in Bristol. So we're kind of taking it around the country. We also do communications workshops, obviously get invited to give a lot of talks. And one of the amazing things is that we have been called on to come to other countries to help them set up Catholic Voices. So word has spread, and that this thing is good and it works. So we've been to Spain. We were in Mexico in February. Fortunately, both Jack and I speak Spanish. So we gave a 3-day training for Voces Católicas Mexico in February, in preparation for the arrival of the Pope there in March. And we're also training a group called Catholic Comment, based on Catholic Voices, in Ireland. And then Wonder of Wonders last year, Anne Corkery, who some of you may know, and Kathryn got in touch and said, we'd love to do it here. And that's why I'm here. And my colleague Jack has just gone back, but I'm staying on for a few days. And hence that's how we ended up in rural Virginia with the guns on the walls. But a fantastic group that Kathryn and Anne have selected. We had about 16 young people, very, very impressive, and we had a very intense but very fruitful few days. So that's the story of the project. Now, what is it what is this method, what is this thing that we've developed that has turned out to be useful and fruitful? Well, I sometimes have to preface this by saying this is not very, very sophisticated. If you're expecting something enormously sophisticated, then you might be disappointed. In fact, it sometimes feels now, going around the world talking about this, like one of those rock bands which they compose a song and suddenly, they find themselves touring and they say, well, actually, we've only got this one song. I hope you're not, when I tell it to you, it won't sound to you very sophisticated. And yet, I'm not sure that it's, in a way, it's ever been done in the way that we did it. Because a lot of people said, actually, this is obvious. We should have all been doing it. And perhaps good ideas are the most obvious ones. But it goes like this, really. When we first of all decided to select what we called the neuralgic issues, which are the ones in the book. The neuralgic point on the body is that point which, when you press it, people squeal, okay? So why is it that when people turn to you and say, and I start the book like this, at a dinner party or wherever, and somebody says, you're a Catholic, aren't you? And the whole kind of dinner party freezes, and they say, how on earth can you believe X, Y, Z? How on earth do you justify what the Pope has reported to have said? Why is it that how can the Church condemn millions to die from AIDS in Africa because of its dogmatic opposition to the use of condoms? How do you explain that? That would be an example. That kind of indignation is important because actually people are turning to you and they're saying, tell us, explain, right? So it's where church and society meet. Now, our insight was that this was also what drove the news. So that when the church is in the news, we can't obviously predict what the news story is going to be, but we can predict that behind that news story will be one of the neuralgic issues, will be an indignation, if you like. That's what fuels that. So our insight in 2010 was, look, we don't know what the news is going to be, but if we drill down on these issues, the neuralgic issues, and we identified 9, I think it was in the end 9 or 10, then we're prepared more or less for whatever story might come up. And indeed, it worked. It really did. So during the papal visit, whatever the story was, whether it's clerical sex abuse or why the church doesn't ordain women, we were prepared. So and the Catholic Voices were really pleasantly surprised to discover that actually they were well prepared to deal with almost anything. So the method, what we did was to identify those neuralgic issues, and then we said, let's look at the positive intention behind the criticism of the church. Now, this is important because when people are upset with the church, it is usually because there is some important value that they feel is being violated. The mistake I believe that Catholics often make is that in their anxiety to defend the church, they will often appear to be attacking the value which lies behind the criticism. Okay, that's what we call positive intention. I noticed the book is on sale out there by Jonathan Haidt called The Righteous Mind. Have any of you read it? I really recommend it. I've only just started reading it, and yet I think what we do fits brilliantly with it, because Jonathan Haidt's insight, and this comes from his own study of scientific studies of how it is that people reach moral and political beliefs, is not actually rational. It's not that people sit down with a blank sheet and look at the arguments on the one hand, on the other, and then reach their conclusions. That's a liberal myth. That's a rationalist myth. In fact, they have people reach their conclusions very, very intuitively, the things that they feel passionately about. And Haidt uses the image of, of elephants and riders. So the elephant is this big, powerful thing which actually dominates most people's views of things. And reason is brought in to justify that. Okay, so the way Haidt puts it is that the elephant will lean one way, and the rider, the little guy on top, furiously paddles, if you like, trying to justify the way he's leaning. Now, this is I like this, because what we were saying was, if you want to speak to the critic, if you want to address the criticism of the church, you have to understand the value. You have to, if you like, understand the elephant behind the values that you're and we have to find a way of speaking to that value in such a way that we're not seen to be against it, and then that can open up a conversation which then becomes reasonable and rational. Okay, and this really came out of our own experience of being in lots of debates, particularly with, whether it was with a clerical sex abuse victim or with a feminist or with a secularist or with a gay rights activist, just learning you can diffuse that defensiveness right at the beginning. So positive intention. And the other thing we did was talk about reframing, which is a very common communications technique, where you identify the frame that is put on the issue by the news media. And by the way, the news media, I think, are merely reflecting the secularist frame. I don't think the media has it in for the church. It's merely that. The church comes off badly often in the media because of the secular frame. So you identify the frame, and the whole task of Catholic Voices, what we train and what we did, was to learn how to move in a very short time, how to move that frame onto the frame that is true, to reframe, in other words, with integrity. How do we tell our story? How do we use the opportunity of the controversy which drives the news to tell the true picture, to tell the story? And that's really what we do in Catholic Voices, is we teach and we learn and we practice doing this. We identify the positive intention, we look at the value, we learn to speak to that value, which then enables us to begin to reframe. I warned you it wasn't complicated. That really is it. But one thing we did learn, and I think we've just seen it now here in Washington, is that it's actually very hard work, to take one of these issues and really drill it down and work through how to reframe and key messages. It's quite time consuming. We worked on gay marriage this over these 3 days. We also, of course, took the HHS mandate. And by the way, how exciting to be here at the moment when the church is suing the government. It's just so exciting. Fantastic also to see the bishops, united, and the way this is bringing together liberals and conservatives in the church. A great public moment, I think, for the church here. So real privilege to be part of that. But we, it was hard work working through the issues and then doing the role plays and so on. But it really pays off, because if you've put in the work, and you know how then to carry off a 2-3. Our model is usually a 3 or 4 minute live interview on radio or TV, which actually is a lot of time if you know how to use it. So that's the method. That's how we've applied it, and it has proved very useful. It continues to prove useful at the moment in the UK. We've got, as I say, an increasing number of Catholic voices, and we are taking on issues. Gay marriage is a big one for us at the moment in the UK. We're, for example, when I get back, taking part in a debate, and we've done, 35, I think, interviews on the gay marriage issue just in the last few weeks. So it's emerging as a voice. Now, one other thing, just before I pass over to Kathryn, is in the wider application of this. There is, as you know, a lot of talk at the moment about the new evangelization, and the bishops of the world, delegates, I should say, of the bishops of the world, are gathering in Rome this October, are they not, for a synod on precisely this issue. And there's documents, and there's a lot of people saying, what is this new, how do we do this new evangelization? New evangelization means, how do we engage societies which are post-Christian, or at least are Christian enough that they believe they know what Christianity stands for, and they think they don't like it. Okay? So the task of the new evangelization is, how do you engage society and propose afresh the gospel and the insights and the wisdom of the church in a new way, in a fresh way, in an appealing way. So here's the thing. I think what we're developing here is a new apologetics which can contribute to the new evangelization. That, you might have guessed, is the title of a couple of talks I'm giving at the moment. And I haven't quite thought it through, but I think it does go something like this. The first task of evangelization, of proposing the gospel, is to actually get people to stop and listen. That actually is the essential task, because people are not interested, they turn away. The news media is the place where, if you like, journalists and editors are learning how to say to people, look, stop, this is important. So the news media, the controversies, the neuralgic issues, opens up space for us then to present a true picture of the church. So maybe what we're developing here is an understanding that Catholics have to be present and have to learn how to be present at that interface, at that juncture, which we might call neuralgic, at that place of indignation and fury, where to many people the Catholic position seemed baffling or scandalous, but they haven't turned away, they haven't rejected, they haven't said, this is all ghastly. I mean, a lot of people have, of course, but most people aren't. They're just indifferent, or they're slightly annoyed and indignant. And that energy, that indignation, that people turning to you and say, how can you justify that, is, I suggest, an opportunity which we need to learn to inhabit. And that maybe is why this project possibly is helping people to do that, and may contribute in that sense to what is emerging as the new evangelization. I think that's enough from me.
Well, there are a lot more from you. One initial question, you talk in the book about teaching people to speak compassionately. You just talked about being humanly, right? If we as Catholics can't talk to people humanly and compassionately, what's wrong? What's wrong there?
Well, one of the things if you'll see at the back of the book, as we've got it, the last chapter is called 10 Principles for Good Communication, which again came out of the project, which we just learned, 10 Principles of Civil Communication. And the first one is indeed the positive intention one. The second one is shed light, not heat. Another one is be compassionate. Another one is, this is about witnessing, not winning. So I suppose the whole point of these, and another one is people won't remember what you said as much as how you made them feel. Now, these all come out of experience of me doing, in my own life, I've done plenty of TV interviews, And you come away thinking sometimes that you've done pretty well and you've laid it out there. And if you're in there with an opponent, you think, oh, okay, he didn't have much to come back at me on. But I'd go to my parish on a Sunday, and one of these ladies in my parish would say, "Oh, I saw you on TV last night," and I'd go, "What do you think of what I said?" "Oh, well, I don't really remember what you said, but I thought you came across very well, Or they would say, "Actually, I thought you came across rather angrily, or you seemed a little bit upset," and you start to realise actually that when most people hear and watch us, they're not so much focused on the content as it's more an impression. So hence, it's not so much what you say as how you make people feel. So I suppose we've thought a lot about how we can communicate really what we are, which is people, of joy and of compassion and of love. But sometimes you have to make an effort to do that because you're in situations where you feel defensive or situations where there appears to be hostility. So the positive intention thing really helps to work through that because you realise that the people that you're engaging with, whether it's the presenter giving you, if you like, the secular frame or your interlocutor in a studio, they're not bad people. They're not actually trying to attack you. They are motivated by a very strong moral sense themselves of what is right and what is wrong. And you need to understand that and respect that. So I suppose it is basic apologetics. Don't judge intentions. Don't assume that people are intrinsically hostile to you. There may be stories of pain and anger. There are stories of pain and anger in everybody's life. When people turned against the church, it's often for reasons which are to do with their elephant rather than, if you like, reasonable, rational thing. And so we succeed insofar as we demonstrate the true face of the church. And even if we can sometimes win a debate, we can then lose the audience. So one of the things we also teach is we're not speaking to the presenter. We're not speaking to the opponent if we're in a debate in the studio. We're speaking to the 2 million or 3 million people who have tuned in that day, who are only half interested in this and they're doing the ironing or feeding the baby and they're only half listening. They're the people we're speaking to. And we learned this during the papal visit because the communications people of the bishops did studies, and they worked out that about 10% of the population was very hostile to the Catholic Church, really did not want the Pope to come, thought the Catholic, and then on the other end there were about 15% who really wanted to listen to the Pope, who thought positively of the Pope and so on. But actually most people were in between, so it was something like 70% of the population was indifferent, a little bit ignorant. They're the people we're speaking to. You'll never convince the 10%, and you're not addressing the 15%, you're addressing them. And one of the things that we try and think about, and my colleague Jack is very good on this, is when you are speaking about these issues, you need to say something or allude to something or present a picture of something that causes people at home to say, yeah, I want that. I want a bit of that. That's really what this is about. It's being able to come away from an interview having communicated something that people say, yes, I think I want something like that.
There's a similar dynamic, of course, in writing where you make people feel a certain way and they're not necessarily reading the entire blog post or article. Is it harder or easier to do the positive intention and all of this in writing?
Well, I know. I think it is a very good, extremely good skill for writing. I mean, I think being able to empathise. I mean, of course, good rhetoric and a good essay is one that appears sometimes to identify with the case that you're in fact demolishing. I mean, I think good writers know how to do that. I think this is the point. However compelling your argument, if you don't show that you empathise and understand the other side, then your own case simply looks less convincing.
Right.
And Jonathan Haidt brings it out in The Righteous Mind very, very well. If you want to change somebody's mind, you have to empathise with them. You have to have that empathy before you can begin to... And if you do that, you can get the elephant, if you like, to lean in a different direction. It doesn't mean you're going to persuade them or win them over, but at least you have the chance to do that. Whereas if you don't, then you never will, however convincing your arguments.
Of course, everyone, it's old wisdom that we don't talk about religion or politics at the dinner party, right? Why would you say it's actually the Christian's duty to be talking about these neuralgic issues and be prepared to defend the church in the public square or the dining room table?
Well, because I find myself at dinner talking about almost nothing else.
Yeah, right.
But I suppose the reason that that idea is that you shouldn't talk about religion, politics, or indeed sex at the dinner table is because these are, of course, deeply divisive issues, and actually it can upset the dinner party when you argue. But on the other hand, if you can defend things without raising your voice, if you can communicate compassionately, people are interested. Indeed, it makes for good conversation, I would say. This is actually all about how to enable conversations that otherwise wouldn't take place, that don't take place.
Speaking of them, you mentioned our training and gay marriage, and there were professionals there who were helping us who said at the beginning of the session, and I understood it, and they were persuading me that we should not have these poor kids have to go do a mock interview on gay marriage because a lot of professionals don't want to talk about it. Why is it so important to prepare people to talk about this issue, for people to talk about this issue? I look intolerant and I'm against civil rights, and why would I want to do that, Austen?
And I suppose that's the point, because that's the major interface at the moment, isn't it? I mean, if you look at some of the major issues over the last few years where the church and society have clashed and where there have been big debates, it's been precisely over issues connected with the gay rights agenda. And so we have to be able to speak in that space. I mean, the way we worked out the same-sex marriage issue in the UK, and it is tough. It is very, very tough. And I do understand why people don't want to address it, because nobody wants to be sick, because the frame is very, very strong. The frame is, if you oppose gay marriage, you're against equality and you're probably homophobic, even though you don't appear to be, even though your words don't say you are, you probably are. Oh, and if you're religious, you're trying to impose a sacramental or religious or biblical understanding of marriage on the rest of society who don't share that. So you're also, by the way, a theocrat. Now actually that's quite a heavy frame, to come up against. But when we
and to break down in a 3-minute interview.
And when gay marriage was announced, when the government suddenly, and excuse me if I rant a little bit, but we suddenly last summer had this announced from our coalition government, no mandate, it hadn't been in a single manifesto, there was no call for it, it came literally out of the blue. And so we were dealing with this. We knew it was going to come, the consultation was going to begin in March. And we wrestled with it for a couple of months. And we started off by saying, gosh, this is really, really hard. And then we thought back to AIDS and condoms. And AIDS and condoms in 2010 was the issue. And remember, this is before Light of the World, when Pope Benedict had issued that clarification in Light of the World. This actually really dominated discussion. And Catholics really felt bad about it. They were constantly being accused of being responsible for the death of millions in Africa because of sacrificing human beings on the altar of dogma. That was essentially the criticism. And we really, we knew we had to tackle that issue. And again, it was hard work and we had to really do the research and drill down. But actually, and I think you'll see the fruits of it in the book, what we learned was really, really fascinating and impressive. And actually, by the time we'd finished with our reframe and we worked out our key messages, all our Catholic voices, actually, they love talking about the topic. So Peter Tatchell, who's the big human rights activist in the UK, always on, he would raise the issue of AIDS and condoms, and our Catholic voices would go, actually, and they would rattle off the arguments and the figures, and actually say, look, actually, the Catholic Church knew that behaviour change was key, while the international organisations wouldn't accept it. In other words, they were able to present the Church as prophetic and as positive and so on. So I think that's what we had. And we having had that experience, gave us the courage then on same-sex marriage to say, look, actually, if we work on this, we think we can do a good reframe. And I think we have done a pretty good reframe. I mean, it's in the book, but I mean, essentially, where we're at is this is not about equality, and this is not actually about homosexuality at all. Our entire argument on same-sex marriage is almost entirely devoid of any references to homosexuality, and by the way, also completely free of religious arguments, because this is about reform to civil marriage, not religious marriage. And our arguments are all about marriage as a public social institution. By the way, I learned a lot from Robbie George and people like that over here. But I mean, that it's a public social institution which is promoted by the state precisely because it does provide a uniquely beneficial environment for children to be raised by their biological parents, which has the most tremendous outcomes. I mean, the sociologists all agree about that. That is why marriage is unique. That's why it's protected by the state. Therefore, if you redefine marriage in that one of those essentials, you actually undermine the purpose for its promotion by the state. So that's kind of our argument. That's where we went. And by the way, you can download our paper from our website is called In Defense of Conjugality, but a lot of the conclusions are in there as well. So that's the result of work we did on that, where we said, how do we escape this frame that this is religious people trying to impose? How do we escape the frame that this is religious people who basically don't like homosexuality? And how do we escape the frame that we are in some way trying to halt progress? But to enter into that, and we spent a weekend in Leeds with the second group of Catholic Voices, we began the process by me putting up slides with people with those placards saying marriage equality, love, and we really entered into why people are in favour of it. And of course it is, equality, love, emancipation of a formerly discriminated against group, allowing people to enter into relationships, stability and love. If you enter into it enough, you go, of course, if you miss out the other factors, of course you'd be in favour of it. And that's why now when I engage with somebody on same-sex marriage, I almost start off saying, look, believe me, I believe in love too. I believe in commitment. I believe in stability. I think marriage, almost that's the elephant you have to speak to right at the beginning before you can even begin to have a conversation about it. The question on the back. How
important is it to be using non-religious arguments in public
Well,
square?
in this case, it was crucial because as soon as you use any religious argument on same-sex marriage, then hang on, I don't share your religious presuppositions, I don't share your sacramental theology, and by the way, I don't believe in the Bible and the Adam and Eve stuff, so what right do you have to tell me what marriage is? It's almost, you have to be very careful also with the assisted suicide argument, that if you start to produce a religious or theological view of suffering, people go, well, your God may want you to suffer endlessly in pain, but hey, I don't share that. What right do you have? And in a pluralist society, those arguments are often pretty fatal. So that's why to reframe, to get out of that, you have to start off by using common law language. Now, the other reason for doing this is that there is a frame in which the church is seen as a self-interested corporation whose interests are antithetical to the public good. Okay, that's the frame. And so in order to escape that, if you start saying the church says this, the church says that, you reinforce that frame. So we encourage, as we did in these last 3 days in Virginia, encourage people to find ways of connecting with ordinary people and their concerns and showing them the benefit. And on the HHS mandate and on religious freedom, well, the work we did was to say, look, religious freedom is the basic principle animating civil society. You curb religious freedom, you curb civil society. Let's explain that. Let's actually present a picture of that. Let's present a picture of my parish with somebody serving the homeless on a Thursday evening. Why are they doing that? Because of their sense of gratitude, because of their own experience of Christ and so on. They want to do that to live out those values. You don't get the service to the homeless if you chill the environment in which that can be expressed. So it's about making those connections. So the person at home says, well, I'm not Catholic, and hey, I have no problem with contraception, but yeah, I can see that would be a problem. I want what the Catholic Church gives society, and I don't want to see less of that. That's how you can make those connections.
This is right.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Now, I think that's very important, and I see that you're identifying the strongest arguments to be made in the public square, but you're approaching it, and perhaps this is the goal, as a public policy outcome, and you seem to be conceding the theological argument. You're kind of putting it aside. And if I heard you correctly, I think you're saying that was kind of a expedient for this particular issue. But at some level, though, won't that communicate something, if not to the public at large, certainly even to some of our own flock, when we're not even willing to get into essentially some controversial religious arguments on behalf of you seem to me to be isolating your strong points to ones that are based in sociology and have no basis in theology. And that would seem to me to communicate that we're afraid to talk about that, or it's not important. Or, and I don't mean to say you're doing anything purposely that's sly, but is it because in this particular arena, this is the best way to communicate? There are other communications that would go on with Catholics. Because, for instance, I think, we've seen that the new evangelization to some extent has to be pointed inward too. It's a question of catechesis and perhaps a failure on that part over the years. And so Well, I agree, and I work in communications and for the church as well, and so I see absolutely your point. But sometimes when the reporters call, they're asking us to make that argument, perhaps the unpleasant one, from a religious point of view, and we can make a very strong presentation based on the method and the research that we've done, but others could do that as well.
I think you probably have misheard me a little bit, because I'm not saying that we somehow pretend that we don't have religious convictions or religious views. It's choosing the ground on which to argue in such a way that you can open up the opportunities to talk about those things. The problem is that if you stay within the frame that's cast on you, nobody's listening. Okay, so on the gay marriage issue, if you start to talk about the sacramental view of marriage, then actually nobody's listening. They're really not, because they're saying, that's got nothing to do with me. Now, there's a later conversation that you can have with somebody who says, well, what is the church's view of marriage? Or in which case you can say, well, yeah, of course, the church has a very beautiful and very inspiring view of marriage, and you can start to talk about the sacramental view and so on. But that conversation has only been made possible because somebody's actually stopped to listen to you. Before then, they're not listening. So it's not expediency, it's choosing ways in which we can break out of the frame which is put on the issue, which prevents people from listening. And the whole purpose actually is to open up the other conversation that really you're talking about. Another point, if you work for the church and in communications and a reporter phones you and says, on behalf of the church, what is your view? In other words, what is Bishop, if you work for Cardinal World, what is, and you're his spokesman, then obviously you give from the bishops, the bishop's task is to teach the faith, and you should communicate that, because a reporter phones asking for that, you give them that. But I think what we're talking about is a different kind of thing, which is lay people as Catholic voices engaged in the public square in these arguments where you have to judge the ground on which you choose to fight.
So you're not, okay, so, and I apologize because I wasn't familiar with your effort, but it sounds very strong. So you're
That's
not,
why we're here to introduce the whole
So you're not
concept.
specifically working for Archbishop Nichols
No.
of Bonhouse. You're actually.
I should have explained that, and I didn't. We are independent entirely of the Bishops' Conference, right? So we don't speak for the official church in any capacity. However, we have the blessing of the bishops in the UK, and here very much the blessing of Cardinal Dolan's been very keen that this should be established here and so on. We have the blessing of the bishops, but we don't speak for them. And the phrase I use for that is, what we say to the media is, look, we're authoritative but not official. Authoritative means, if you ask us what the church says and the church teaches, we can tell you. But if you want to know what Cardinal Wuerl thinks of, Obama's recent declaration on XYZ, you have to go to Cardinal Wuerl's spokesman, right? We can't tell you that. What we can tell you is about the church's view of religious freedom and religious freedoms. We can offer you commentary on the issue from an informed and authoritative Catholic perspective. Do you see the difference? And actually it works very well because on the whole, do you want to just tell me what your position is before I go?
I'm the Director of Communications for Bishop Laverty in the Diocese.
Right. So I mean, you know very well that you get a lot of calls from reporters saying, can we have, the bishop tell us something about X, Y, Z to me? And actually, you don't want to, because when the bishop speaks, it generates a headline by virtue of him being a bishop, and he has to be very careful what he says because he's speaking with the mind of the church. So very often, I'm guessing you will say no, right? He doesn't want to speak on this. Now, generally, without us, that's as far as it goes, okay? But now, in London, in Eccleston Square, where the Bishops' Conference is based, they say, we don't want to speak on this, no bishop wants to speak on this, but we do know this bunch of Catholics who you could call if you want, right? And they go, well, who are they? And they say, well, they are just actually well-trained people who have the blessing of the bishops who could talk about this issue. Do you see? And it works very well because it fills the gap that's in a way left by the bishop's reluctance, understandable reluctance to speak.
A modern Frenchie kind of stepping into the void that's left there. I mean, I could certainly see where we could, there are instances, I take your point very well, where just by virtue of Bishop Laverty or Cardinal Wuerl, Cardinal Dolan says it's a specific type of communication. And so you do want a group of lay faithful who can step up. Because there are clearly, and I meant to concede that at the beginning, there are clearly venues where the argument is better coming from
Exactly.
someone.
And that's the other point. is that often the media will say, we want a bishop or we want a priest, and you go, why? And they say, because they represent the church. No, they don't. Why do you specifically need? Now, obviously, if it's talking about, priestly celibacy or something, a priest might be better to be on it, or if it is a complex. But actually, on the whole, this is something that lay people can and should be able to do quite well.
And also, I don't know if you have the same problem in the UK, but frequently, I think that having well catechized people, lay people ready to go into the media, sort of provides some air cover in the media for bishops to do their job, so we have so many examples here in the U.S. where people are frustrated or critical of bishops for not speaking out on a particular issue, and frankly, I think it would be easier for them to be able to do their job, both catechizing and adding to this public discussion if it weren't just them. It was funny. I remember there was a lot of criticism, and then I got a lot of criticism for defending him, Cardinal Dolan in New York when New York legalized gay marriage. Why didn't Cardinal Dolan, people would email me this, why didn't Cardinal Dolan go into Andrew Cuomo's office, the governor of New York, and tell him this could not be done? He's a Catholic, and well, yes, he's a Catholic who supports gay rights for marriage and supports abortion. And I don't think that Cardinal Dolan walking into his office would have made that much of a difference, So
it would have made a headline, that's for sure.
Yeah, right, exactly. And it would have made, I don't know what it would have made, but it wouldn't have changed the course of events. And if you can show that Catholics in America who vote really care about these issues and really take them seriously, it's not just like some old-fashioned value that priests don't even preach in some parishes, that's something, and that's a cultural shift that we can engage in the new evangelization. And so I think that's part of the picture, just a fuller picture of the church in the public square.
Exactly,
right?
That's the point, isn't it? That actually, always to have clergy and bishops speak for the church actually does misrepresent the church in a way, because the church, of course, is also, there are some issues, on which lay people, I think, and the bishops will be the first to say this, really are to be preferred. Anything to do with women, for example, obviously much better to have a woman speaking about it. Celibacy, marriage, sexuality. There are various areas which actually convincing lay people are they're just much more convincing because of their own lived experience.
And I think part of our training yesterday, if it was only yesterday, we had young women talking about women in the church in different facets, contraception and marriage, and Mary, one of the converts, talked about. And it was beautiful and inspiring, and you could tell in a lot of cases it was coming from a very personal place too, in addition to their love for the church and their understanding of church teachings, and that's just so inspiring. I think it's so inspiring for bishops to know that there really is a hunger to hear more about this in the public square. But I think also for other Catholics to know that they're not holed up in some rural area and all alone. There are actually people in metropolitan areas who believe these crazy things too. I think it's a really encouraging thing.
And one last plus is deniability. I mean, if one of us goes out and says something stupid, your bishop could just say nothing to do with us.
Right. Can I?
Yeah.
Sorry. A couple of things. Yeah, I recall with the congressional hearing, which supposedly was about religious freedom and representatives of churches were asked to speak. That was the whole Sandra Fleck thing when it got started. Was where are the women for the first panel? And they had no women because it was so happened that there were no religious leaders who were women for that particular panel. But so they quickly spun that one, and no one really recovered from it afterwards. But and then interestingly, I'd be interested to see what you thought of the dynamics of this in the Sibelius case. People were demanding the cardinal world take action, very similar to what Kathryn was describing. Go in there and just tell John DeGioia at Georgetown, what to do, and don't take no for an answer, and excommunicate everybody or do something. Right. I mean, literally, I'm with the National Catholic Register, and we're just constant churning. And he didn't do it, and it was interesting observing the dynamics of how it was handled. First there was an editorial, then there was a statement, and then a couple days ago there was another editorial. So there was no personalization of a male religious leader telling Sibelius, a woman, that she shouldn't be there. So that was one thing they prevented doing. Was there, I did also think if you'd had a female spokeswoman, she could have presented that point of view if you needed a face for it. What do you think of that dynamic for that? And then I wanted to ask you what you thought. I've seen this a couple of times. Archbishop Laurie did that piece about the kosher deli and how he presented the HHS mandate in a parallel situation of a kosher deli and people telling a kosher deli how to handle something. And it was very clever on one hand, but in interviewing several people, and John Garvey at CUA said this to me yesterday, trying to sort of make a connection and saying, well, it's like the kosher deli, it's like this, it's like that. Well, there's another way in which your point is well considered, and that is, no, it's not actually like a kosher deli, because we think abortifacients actually kill, unborn life, and so it's on a natural law basis, there's something more at work. And when does that come up? I mean, they're very loath to bring that up now because of the war on women rhetoric and everything. So just a little bit first about the statements versus the person, and then secondly, how do we keep in mind the natural law issues in the mandate fight without alienating people?
Well, on the spokesperson question, I think this is exactly why the Catholic Voices model is a good one, because it will look better if there's a woman who loves the church on TV talking about Kathleen Sibelius, right, or talking about the bishop's report on the religious sisters, right. It's just a fact. I am sort of naturally loath to look for the woman or, play games like that, but it's a reality. I mean, images matter and presentation matters. And so that's a reality. And so in the case of that hearing, for instance, of course, it was completely disingenuous because the second panel had women and doctors but that was not important because the storyline was what it was. And I think that if we had something like they have in Britain in place at that point, we may have had a fighting chance in that news cycle. We really didn't have a fighting chance in that news cycle as it played out, unfortunately. But on the question of wanting to make real arguments about real things, like for instance the abortifacients. Now, I personally don't think we should use the word abortifacient because I don't think people know what you're talking about. I think abortion-inducing drugs, people get. Why should Notre Dame have to offer employees abortion-inducing drugs, right? And I do think that that's something I talk about the coercive HHS mandate that mandates sterilization and contraception and abortion-inducing drugs. I think that's an important part of it. I do think that people have to understand that it's a religious freedom argument, but I'm not afraid to go the next step because I can keep engaging a little bit. And I think people need to know what it is, right? And people still don't know what it is. But I did want to ask you a little bit more about the religious freedom argument and how you think we're doing, because you have been observing it a bit here and when you were abroad, obviously at home.
Did you want to come in on that issue?
Good point. I agree with you on the abortifacient terminology. I've had difficulty with that. It's true, and it's the correct way to refer to it. The problem is figuring out what word to use in its place, because I have gotten tagged in conversations with the reporter when I say abortion-inducing, because some will believe that's dishonest because they think we're saying RU486 or something like that, which is not the same thing.
Right.
What we're talking about here are high level, basically morning after pills with high levels.
Right.
So it is tricky. I've had this issue a couple of times now, because also, to your point, we're saying it makes more sense to, just from an argumentative point of view, to lead with sterilization and abortion-connected drugs as opposed to just contraception, which a lot of the reporters just shorthand.
Right. Although I think it's also important to point out and know that New York Times polling suggests that when you ask people if Catholic institutions should have to offer contraception, they didn't even go into sterilization and abortion-inducing drugs. people think there's something off about that, right? So we can win the argument without even talking about that, but I don't think we should be afraid to, because the fact of the matter is Ella's in there, and it's an abortion-inducing drug, right?
I mean, I don't sort of would claim to come here, and tell you how to argue this, because I think there's so many great minds working on this here. What I could just do is stand back for a minute and say, what's the frame and how do we escape it? Now, one of the things that's operative almost always when the church is in play is that where there's the church, where there are institutions, people look for victims. Okay, so the victim institution thing is a very powerful dynamic in Western society. Actually, because of the gospel, it's become distorted, but there we go. We have to be aware of that dynamic all the time. Now, in the secular frame, in the contemporary liberal secular frame, it's extremely hard for people to conceive of the church as a victim. Okay? And that's why, by the way, religious freedom, which is a massive issue throughout the world, I mean, the great untold story of our time is the phenomenal marginalization, persecution, and indeed often death that Christians undergo throughout the world. 80% of all religious freedom violations are against Christians. Why is that so underreported in our own Western media? It is because they have difficulty in conceiving of the church as victim. Why? Because it's seen as a powerful institution that's hegemonic in some way. So I think this issue here presents a wonderful opportunity to reframe that, to show that actually here we have a coercive state, an authoritarian state, may not be wanting to be authoritarian, but the effect of its actions is to coerce not a great big monolithic institution, but that parish down the road with the outreach to the homeless. So I think you win this argument to the extent that you can demonstrate that. To the extent that you stay within the frame of institution, then it becomes state versus institution, and I'm not sure who wins out of that. Do you see? Whereas if it's coercive state and civil society group trying to live out its own values and serving society, if people see that is threatened, then I think the argument can be won.
Yes.
I'm usually kind of in the minority and having mixed feelings on this in some conversations in these circles, but I mean, going back to this
On what? Just before you know, what is it?
well, on the exercise of things like Canon 915 and formal sort of public denial of communion.
Right.
I've in observing this over the last 10 or 15 years, I've seen an increasing chorus among sort of Orthodox Catholics saying we've got to do this, we've got to encourage and sort of push bishops to apply this more and more. And I used to sort of be on that side of things, but more and more, I guess I have a very mixed feeling about that. Just not so much from my knowledge of canon law, which I don't have much, but it's the idea of, from a practical perspective, when this type of thing hits a news cycle or hits the public, the average man, I mean, it's not just the politician or whoever you're closing the dialogue off with. It's a whole bunch of people that I'm going to come across in a bar. That's what they're going to talk about. They're not going to want to talk about anything else.
Yes, quite. And this is actually a very good example of where the frame here is authoritarian institution overreaching itself and trying to dictate terms in an area which is autonomous from the church. So, politicians exist in the temporal sphere, they have consciences, they're accountable to voters, anything where the church appears to be telling politicians how to vote, it goes down very badly. What's the reframe here? The reframe here is that actually the church also has, as a teaching body, the duty to teach its own faithful what is true and what isn't true in what the Catholic Church teaches. So when a very prominent public figure describes themselves as a Catholic and uses their Catholicism also as a way of credentialing themselves, while at the same time being in favour of abortion and so on, the Church has a duty to point out the contradiction in that. Okay, and so the reframe here is the Church is a teaching organisation which is teaching its own faithful to distinguish, rather than bishops telling politicians how to vote. On the specific issue of denial of communion, I go into that in the book actually, because it's a very neuralgic issue, and I refer.
You don't say.
No, but I do think the outcome of the 2004 row over that, where the bishops got together and couldn't agree, was very interesting, because in fact they couldn't agree, I think, for quite good reasons. I mean, they all accepted the need for that kind of public disciplining and so on. On the other hand, they didn't want to politicise the altar rail, as I think Cardinal McCarrick put it. And actually, it was then Cardinal Ratzinger, wasn't it, who said, actually, you need to deal with this issue by speaking to the politician privately in terms of denial of communion. And I thought the way that was resolved actually was, in a way, very impressive. The fact that the bishops were divided over it and the fact that they were weighing up these two things demonstrates that the idea that the church tells politicians how to vote cannot be true, do you see?
I think too, and this is not to do another commercial for Catholic Voices. I have the reason I like Catholic Voices is because I think it's a solution to problems out there and a contribution. But I think part of the reason that there's such a clamoring in certain circles that you do condemn Joe Biden and make a very public statement about whoever it is. We can go through a whole list, is because, well, so many of the Catholics in the public square, right, that we can name off are people who are advocating for abortion rights, etc. And I think that if you can flood the media zone, so to speak, with lots of people who happen to believe what the Catholic Church teaches, well, it becomes less of a scandal that, a Kennedy or whoever it is a Catholic supporter of abortion rights, because we see all these others who actually do believe, and I think it gives courage to others. And I almost think that becomes more of an issue, which will be more of a pastoral thing. And I also, catechesis has been so bad, right? Nancy Pelosi wrote an essay in a book a couple of years ago where she talked about how she had the struggle with her granddaughter talking about the real presence, because Nancy Pelosi wasn't quite sure about the real presence, right? Now, that makes my heart go out to Nancy Pelosi, because if she doesn't actually believe in the real presence, well, that explains a lot, right? And I think that by having more well-catechized Catholics out in the public square, ready to engage in dinner parties and all the rest, I think it helps, it helps the priests do their jobs. It helps the bishops do their jobs and help with the catechesis. And we contribute, right, to the catechesis. One important part that I don't think we've talked about Catholic Voices is it's apostolic. We had a chaplain on site. We began with Mass in the morning. We ended with a reflection. People went to confession and whatnot during the course of their own. It wasn't built into the schedule, and that kind of nourishment is a very important part of it. So it's not just
and the role of the chaplain. Do you want to say something about the chaplain's role in this?
Well, he has an essential, if not the essential, role in all of this, because ultimately we're not just a bunch of people who think that we're smart and ready to go on TV and we have something special to offer. No, we do have a gift, right? That we want to share with people, but our sharing of it is only as good as our souls, right? Right? Our communications are only ever going to be as good as our souls are. So that's an important part of this whole thing.
And I'll just add to that, again, at the back of the book, you'll see a prayer, which was composed, in fact, by our chaplain in the UK. And it's a prayer that we carried around, we say at the beginning of our meetings, and we carry around with us. And when we're going to go and do an interview, we say it in the green room before going into the studio, that we have a duty to prepare ourselves absolutely the best we can. But, it's important also to leave room for the Holy Spirit and to rely on the Holy Spirit in all of this. And actually, again, that the experience of the Catholic Voices was that they would start out fairly scared, and they would end up saying, wow, I just felt when I was in that interview, just it all came out, and I really felt, and that is the quality of the Spirit, of course, which we can't rely on, we can't assume, but we can at least invite to be present in what we do.
Austen, at one point in the book, you talk about how empathy is the beginning of dialogue, I think is the quote. Yeah. So how do you do this, the empathy thing and the dialogue? And, we all famously know about finding common ground, right? How do you do that without diluting the gospel?
Yeah, well, it's the method I was talking about earlier. I mean, positive intention, or in Haight's terms, finding somebody's elephant, is about taking the time, because it does take time and it takes effort, to sit in the space of the critic, to sit in their moral space, and actually try and feel what it's like, that's empathy is something. It's not an artificial thing. It's not when you're sitting with somebody saying, "Oh, I know how you feel." actually you need to have lived a little bit of it. And with our reframing workshops, that we have actually sat, we've even role played. In fact, with the same-sex marriage, we've role played. One of us is in a gay relationship, and we have adopted a child, right? And it's very interesting. And then the others are the Catholic voices, and I always ask them after how they feel. And the ones playing the gay people say, oh, you feel really good. You feel smug, actually. You feel history's on your side. You feel, that you're. And I said to them, we need to work on this until we feel. We need to feel that when we go out into the public square to speak from out of our faith tradition, we're not having to apologize or be defensive or justify, because actually we really do believe we have good news. But we really do believe this is for the common good. This is for the public good. It's not just about defending the church's interest and the church's teaching. It is about what we offer society. The society actually will be a better place if we are present in the public square. And Pope Benedict in the UK, when he was in Parliament, he gave this remarkable address to Parliament. I was there. I was lucky enough to be invited, and it was an extraordinary moment. I could feel the wheels of history just turning. Apart from the fact that he was the one event for which he was actually quite late. He was about 25 minutes late. And the entire British political establishment was there. The current Prime Minister, all the previous Prime Ministers, all the ministers, the shadow ministers, the Church of England bishops were all up there, sitting there waiting patiently for the successor of St. Peter to arrive. And I thought, the myth of the Protestant nation has now died, But so it was historical for that reason.
Right.
But what he then said, which was, we all benefit when faith and reason are in, when religion and politics are in dialogue with each other, that they need each other, and the public square needs us, and we need also to the public square, for the benefit of the church. So if you listen to what Pope Benedict has been saying so often in these great speeches, the Bundestag, Westminster Hall, the Collège de Bernardin in Paris, particularly those three, there's a fourth one I think I've forgotten, but those great public square speeches, I actually think, by the way, a good editor should put those together in a volume with a kind of some commentary, and just because I think these are and they're invitations, they're challenges to society, but they're also big invitations to us. So and of course the bishops here have been making it. Archbishop Gomez very beautifully said this is the time for Catholic action and Catholic voices. Even used the name. Right. We are in a historical moment now where the religious freedom issue is becoming burning, as you're living it here, but it's burning for us as well in the UK. We had Catholic adoption agencies close a few years ago. We woke up and recognised that we couldn't rely on the state anymore to defend religion in the public square, that we would have to make our case, we would have to get out there. So this is happening across the Western world, and the Pope has realised this. The Pope actually realised it quite a long time ago. I think we weren't listening, or I wasn't listening, when he was talking about the dictatorship of relativism. I remember when what was that? Now we know what he meant. And so he is saying, and the bishops here are saying, we need Catholics to step up to the plate and into the public square. We all know that that's true, but how you do it, how you equip people, how you allow people, and how also you create the space for us to communicate is something that we need to think through. And maybe Catholic Voice is one of those methods of doing it. And if it contributes to that, I think, I'll feel very proud. And I do feel, being in Virginia, just as I am tonight, with the great Kalo and some of the amazing people I've been with, that something important, is coming to birth here, and it's wonderful to be a part of that.
Well, and the one other papal statement I can think of was to U.S. bishops in January,
yes,
where he said we need a laity, as Cardinal Newman, who's back there, said as well.
Yes, he's one of the ones we pray to at the back, because of course it's Newman who says, that famous quote, "I want an educated laity, neither." However it goes. I should be able to rattle it.
Yeah, I should have it memorized now. I've quoted it enough.
We use that a lot because, of course, when we were setting up CV in the UK, the prospect of Cardinal Newman was very much on everybody's minds because of the forthcoming beatification. And we actually thought, yes, that vision he had of the laity, that's what,
And he, of course, has so much to offer us in his writing, too, to help in that well-educated. You were talking about history and history being on our side. Here, there's this feeling that gay marriage is just inevitable. So don't bother fighting it because it's where history is going. Why do you feel differently? Do you?
I feel very passionately about same-sex marriage for the same reason I think we should be passionate about the HHS mandate, because what is at stake here is precisely civil society. And if the state does not know its limits, if the state believes it can rearrange the architecture of civil society, then we are moving in a direction which I think you Americans should be very, very alarmed at. You should see this in direct contradiction to everything this nation was founded on, and indeed Western countries that are founded on pluralist principles. And remember that pluralism is much bigger. I mean, people confuse liberalism and pluralism. What's at stake here is pluralism. It's a plural society in which a variety of communities jostle up against each other and contribute to the common good and engage with each other, likely regulated by the state. That's what's at stake here. And that's why I feel passionately about same-sex marriage. You cannot give up on that fight, because it's as I say, it's not about gay rights, it's not about equality. It's about the fact that this is the fundamental institution of civil society which predates the church, predates the state. The state and the church recognize and bless it and dignify it and have added to it. But there's a precedence there which has to be respected, and the state is overreaching itself. So that's where the fight is, and I think you can't give up on it. Actually, you have to make that argument. And by the way, our experience with polling, we've done some polls in the UK. We did a poll a couple of months ago, which showed that 70% of British people are opposed to the redefinition of marriage, or rather, I think, are in favour of maintaining the current definition of marriage, which is man and woman. So, now the people were very surprised with this figure, and a lot of activists said that we must have, fiddled the poll or something. In fact, because other polls show about 50-something, I think similar to here, 50-something support for gay marriage. The reason that you get these two different figures is that I believe most people do not realise that allowing gay marriage implies a redefinition of marriage. And I think when they do realise that, they tend to turn against it. So I think we have to make that argument.
Because we normally just talk in terms of tolerance. And
yes,
it doesn't.
You think about opening something up to allow a group to enter it, but it feels very permissive. It feels so you don't want to be seen to be opposing something which appears to bring benefits to people. In fact, when you point out that it involves a radical redefinition of marriage in such a way that my marriage is redefined by this, people actually don't like that.
So does that begin the answer to the question, how does a gay marriage affect your marriage?
Yes.
How does it hurt your marriage?
Well, what it
because that seems implausible to people that it would matter to your marriage.
And we had to work hard on this one as well, because of course the great gay rights theme was if you're against gay marriage, don't marry somebody of the same sex. That slogan that's used, and it's actually quite a powerful point. It's a pluralist point. How does this affect you? Is the challenge, and we do have to have an answer to that. And I suppose the answer that we've developed is that because marriage provides a unique environment for children in which they can be raised by their own natural parents, and because the outcomes of that are so beneficial both to children and to society at large, that is why the state is in the business of promoting marriage and protecting it and privileging it. If you dethrone that model of marriage and you say that no longer is what marriage is, then why have marriage at all? Why propose? And also you are telling future generations that there's somehow no better way of raising children. Well, that's just not true. Hell, I was brought up by divorced parents. I'm sure some of you in this room were brought up by single parents. Death and divorce prevent it. And some people are brought up by maiden aunts and foster carers and do a fantastic job. But something is missing in all of those arrangements, which is why they're not promoted in the same way. And to dethrone marriage as that model, I think will have tremendous consequences for future generations. It's very, very hard, of course, to point to the evidence because it's so new, isn't it, in our society?
Right. On another neuralgic issue, abortion. You're fairly optimistic. We're 4 decades in right here, and what gives you any sense of optimism?
Well, I've lived this one sort of quite personally in the sense that when I worked for the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster, the issue came up a lot, and because there was a move in Parliament to reduce the time limit, and the Cardinal was very involved, and I was involved as his spokesman. And there was a remarkable a poll, in fact, done by The Observer, a leading kind of liberal newspaper, of women in the UK, and it showed that women in the UK are turning against abortion, that they think it's far too easily available, that people have them for far too frivolous reasons, and there was a lot of evidence in that poll that women believe that this idea that women simply have the choice to abortion, so on, that freedom is not an unrestricted one, blah blah blah. Now, it was quite traumatic in terms of change. Now, one of the key shifts in British society on this, and I'm sure it's the same here, were the famous 4D ultrasound pictures produced by, where you remember those pictures when they first appeared, and there was a headline in a British newspaper which was "Walking in the Womb." Suddenly, what had been talked about in the abstract was now vividly, dramatically human. And it is, of course, the awakening of society to the humanity of the unborn child, which is the key thing in all of this. That's something which, frankly, pro-life movements making every argument, that those pictures did more.
It's harder to turn away when you have a picture, right?
And I think all these arguments about rights of child versus rights of the unborn versus rights of the woman, frankly, will end up in stalemate. What clinches it is the humanity of the unborn. Once you can embrace that and accept that, and that becomes part of the conversation, then you can start to have a different conversation, which is about weighing up the fact that here we are dealing with humanity, with a child. Now let's weigh that up against other rights, so-called rights, and I know we obviously believe that those rights triumph, but the secular argument about this has to be about weighing up with rights. What's prevented the proper argument is the denial of the humanity of the unborn. So I think that's the crucial shift. So I believe that, yes, I think abortion in future will become socially much less respectable and much less hidden in the future. At the moment, it's hidden, and I think in the way that there's been a moral awakening on green issues, on awakening to the fragility of the planet, to our need to. I think it's that same growing awareness is also evident, I think, in this discussion.
It's all about stewardship, isn't it? Isn't there a running vein through Catholic social teaching, whether it be the planet or human lives themselves?
It's seeing this world which we're in and the bodies that we inhabit as something that we're profoundly connected to, that has a dignity all of its own, that what we do, matters and has an impact. That's the religious sense, of course. And it is the awakening of that which is far more important than anything else, I think, in any of these discussions. I think I'm becoming, over time, it's funny, here I am, talking about apologetics and using good, and I'm actually becoming less and less convinced that arguments matter. I think it's much deeper. I think we have to learn to deal with the elephants, in Jonathan Haidt's words, the other things that lie behind. We have to learn how to speak to those.